Hello everyone, welcome to the lecture on cultural studies. This lecture is a part of your paper on youth, media and society. This lecture will introduce you to the established cultural theories and their relationship with modern youth culture. The lecture will focus on the relationship between youth, subculture and the related issues in cultural studies. The theoretical strands of traditional cultural studies that largely came from Frankfurt School of Critical Theory and Brigham School of Cultural Studies remained significantly relevant in studying youth and youth subculture over the decades. The relationship between culture and media content has been an interesting area for cultural theorists. The youth as a cultural category finds a unique place in the traditional cultural theories. The youth who are believed of having higher cultural affinities tend to be an interesting subject of study for the scholars of cultural theory. The media projection and portrayal of youth and its impact on audience perception about youth can be studied in the light of the established understanding of media culture. For the modern sociologists, the relevance of popular culture and how youth get influenced by the popular culture is a significant area of study. The cultural theorists like Stuart Hall, who focused on the issues of encoding and decoding and representation, are quite relevant in understanding the media's cultural influence on today's youth cultural studies. The cultural studies in paradigm of mass communication focuses on the study of media in their historical, economic and socio-political context. The cultural theorists have focused on the cultural patterns and forms disseminated through media content and the way it influences and resonates in this society. The Brigham School of Cultural Studies in 1960s and 1970s was the first to focus a variety of critical approaches for the analysis, interpretation and criticism on cultural formations in this society. The pioneers of cultural studies, Richard Hogarth and Stuart Hall, tried to theorize the relationship between the cultural representations and ideologies of class, race, ethnicity and gender in cultural text, especially popular culture. They began to examine the formation of popular culture and its effect on the audience by newspapers, television, radio and films. The cultural theorist Stuart Hall conceptualized the idea of encoding and decoding, which explains how mass-produced products in media are produced and how are they interpreted by the consumers in varied and different ways and contexts. Another important cultural theorist, Raymond Williams, explains the term culture in three perspectives: culture as an artistic activity, production of mass culture through music, literature, theatre, film and painting; culture as a way of life, production of mass culture through the meaning of the symbols of particular way of life, example, language, dress code, norms and behavior; culture as a process of development, evolution of culture through historical processes. The culture itself is produced through the course of history in a society. Characteristics of cultural studies. In cultural studies, the subject matter is examined by studying the practices in existing culture and their relations with power. The primary aim here is to understand how power shapes and influences the culture in a country or society. The cultural studies aims to understand the complex forms of existing culture and the political context. It examines how the contextual politics influences the cultural forms in a society. Cultural studies consider culture of having two functions. On the one hand, it emerges as the object of study, and on the other hand, culture provides space for politic reaction and criticism. The cultural studies involves intellectual factors and pragmatism. Cultural studies try to bridge the gap between the local existing culture and the universal form of knowledge. It maintains the common identity while engaging and understanding diverse culture and the intuitive knowledge. One of the important functions of the cultural studies is to evaluate the modern society on moral grounds and examine the political influence on culture in a particular society. The cultural studies itself works on the influence of social constructivism. Types of cultural studies. Number 1, British cultural materialism. The study of culture in Britain began as cultural materialism with the pioneering work of F.R. Louis Raymond Williams, who was one of the significant theorists of this tradition. Defined culture as a productive process and cultural materialism as residual, emergent and oppositional elements of the culture. The cultural materialism theorists believed that the culture is a process in which the forces having hegemonic positions in the society appropriate the historical materials like text and art to validate a particular form of culture. Dollimore and Sinfield, in their book Political Shakespeare, have identified four important characteristics of cultural materialism. They are historical context, close contextual analysis, political commitment, and theoretical method. New historicism. The literary theory of New Historicism was developed in America in 1980, and the term was coined by literary critic Stephen Greenbelt. The fundamental theory of New Historicism proposes that the literature that exists should be studied and interpreted in its historical context. According to Michael Wallner, the text is historical and the history is textual. American multiculturalism. Multiculturalism is a political philosophy which involves diverse ideologies and policies. These policies involve advocating equal respect to various cultures in a society. One of the primary features of multiculturalism is that it tries to maintain uniformity in social integration, assimilation of culture, and ethnic segregation. The American multiculturalism is based on the assimilation of African American, Latin, Asian American, and American Indian cultures. Postmodernism and popular culture. The philosophy of postmodernism was introduced by Jean-Francois Lyotard in 1979 as critical interpretation of culture, literature, philosophy, history, and art. The philosophy of postmodernism emerged as a reaction to the 20th century modernism. It reflects upon the emergence of a society in which mass media and popular culture are the most powerful agents that define the norms and perception in a society. Post-colonial studies. The post-colonial studies focuses on the intellectual discourse that tries to explain the culture in a particular society in relation to the colonial legacies and imperialism. The culture is understood from the perspective of imperial control and economic exploitation by the colonizer on the native people. The post-colonial studies has a type of cultural studies focuses on the important concepts of cultural imperialism and cultural invasion. Youth subculture in cultural studies. The youth subculture has been a subject of interest for the media industries and media researchers. The youth are the most visible social actors in media content. The sociologists consider the youth subcultures as the product or epitome of social change or a barometer of future changes. The concept of youth subculture explains the youth behavior and attitudes in relation to the changing contextual dynamics of politics, economy, and society. The concept of youth subculture was initially used by the Chicago School of Cultural Studies in 1950s. The British cultural theorists began studying youth subculture in relation to the delinquent behavior reflected by the young people. Their methods of understanding youth culture largely relied upon psychological and psychoanalytical studies of young people. The 21st youth cultural studies involve new approaches of understanding the youth culture. The present day issues pertaining to youth do find relevance in classical cultural theories, but the scholars in the field have tried to adopt new theoretical and methodological approaches to the research on youth. The researchers studying youth culture, while borrowing the core philosophical strands from the cultural theories, try to study modern day youth, fashion, interests, and lifestyle. Post-subculture theory. The cultural theories pertaining to sociology and media are applied to understand the substantiate issues of gender, politics, ethnicity, and media usage and media representation. The concept of media representation in cultural theory is an essential issue pertaining to the present day youth. How youth is portrayed and presented in media content certainly needs to be studied in the light of traditional cultural theories. The issues pertaining to commodification of youth culture in today and commercial media platforms like films, magazines, and reality shows is an interesting area of study for communication scholars. The concept of post-subculture was first introduced by the sociologist Steve Redhead in 1990s. The idea developed as a reaction to the earlier understanding of youth as a subculture and was powered by the emergence of music and dance forms of late 1980s as intrinsic part of modern youth culture. The concept was further developed by David Muggleton in his book Inside Subculture: The Postmodern Meaning of Style in 2000. The era of post-subcultural theory that existed between late 1990s and early 2000s came up as a challenge to the established notion of youth as a subculture, especially by Stanley Cohen and Gary Clark. The central idea of the post-subcultural theory in youth studies was that understanding the culture of youth contained the complexities because of the high cultural affinities reflected by the modern youth. It is believed that it was during the mid-1980s that the shift from subculture to post-subculture occurred during the time when cultural theorists started acknowledging the impact of postmodernism. The post-subcultural theorists like Malborn and Bennett argue that in context of the plethora of hyper-social cultural environments and globalized cultural industries, the youth attain a flexible and articulated lifestyle. The post-subcultural theory focused on the need to understand the cultural dimensions pertaining to modern youth in parlance of the collective practices of youth that includes fashion, lifestyle, and the influence of commercial cultural industries like the movies. However, according to Schildrick and MacDonald, post-subcultural theories, while focusing on youth images, commerce and objects, exclude the consideration of social inequalities and identities. The cultural inequalities in modern societies are an essential aspect that must be taken into consideration while approaching the area of youth culture. The youth delinquency and cultural studies. The studies on youth behavior and attitude produced by Brigham School of Contemporary Cultural Studies came to be known as the new subcultural studies on youth. In their book, Cool Places, Geographies of Youth Culture, Tracy Skeleton, Gil Valentine, and Deborah Chambers argue that the post-World War society perceived the youth as a problem in the society. The reason for the perception was the growing economic and cultural independence of youth. The formal academic inquiry into youth as a social category began in 1950s and 1960s in Britain and United States. The scholarly interest in youth delinquency began to study the unconventional youth behavior of reluctance, defiance of authority, alienation and hedonism. The cultural theorists in Britain emphasized on the cultural artifacts and leisure interests of youth as delinquency. They observed that rather than the conventional cultural thought in the school, the youths are interested in the culture based on fashion and pop music. The delinquent youth culture came to be considered as the dominant youth culture, as stated by Skeleton, Valentine, and Chambers. The early cultural theorists focused on youth delinquency and ignored the characteristics of youth as a social category. Besides, having empirical weaknesses in the youth studies, they also lacked the essential inquiry into the issues related to the gender in youth, popular culture and youth. The popular culture involves the generation and mainstreaming of attitudes, ideas, images, perspectives within a given culture by mass media. The concept was developed in late 20th century and scholars started focusing on how entertainment, fashion and technology is influencing the living pattern and attitudes among the society. The youth have high affinity with popular culture, which is especially disseminated through media platforms like TV, magazines, and internet. The youth are influenced by pop culture in many aspects of day-to-day life, such as fashion, celebrities, music, and social networking sites. The youth embrace popular culture to express and share the feeling and opinions by adopting the characteristics of culture being disseminated through mass media. However, the uncontrolled addiction to popular culture can prove dangerous and harmful for youth, and they can adopt the illegal or morally wrong attributes from the culture they are consuming through mass media. Some of the disadvantages of popular culture on youth through mass media platforms is the inappropriate behavior in music, addiction to social media, the culture through television, and drug abuse. Conclusion. Summing up this lecture, we hope that you have understood the characteristics and the various types of cultural studies. The cultural studies are a multidisciplinary area of study in sociology and mass communication. The lecture helped us learn about the relevance of cultural studies in understanding the youth subculture. The critical theories of culture from Frankfurt School and cultural studies from Brigham School are still relevant in studying and understanding the modern youth culture. The scholars today focus more on the characteristics of popular culture powered by film, fashion, and lifestyle, and its impact on the perception of youth. The media is considered to be a key player in mediating the youth culture through its effective depiction of youth. We discussed youth post subculture as an extension of youth subculture and an essential area of inquiry. Hope you enjoyed the lecture. For more details, please read the e-text of this lecture properly and attempt the questions in the end. Thank you.